Welcome to Supercool, the show tracking the rise of the low-carbon economy, a multi-trillion-dollar transformation reshaping global industries. Each week, we spotlight the climate technologies, business models, and strategies already cutting carbon, boosting profits, and improving modern life. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe or leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you also want to go deeper into Supercool Climate Solutions Now Scaling, check out our weekly newsletter. You can find it at getsuper.cool. Mauricio Rodas teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. If he'd been there when I was an undergrad, there's a pretty strong chance I'd be working in his field today, urban climate finance. But Mauricio isn't your typical academic. In fact, he's not your typical anything. Before becoming the youngest elected mayor in the history of Quito, Ecuador, his country's capital, Mauricio had already run for president, founded a political party, launched a think tank in Mexico City, and studied at Purdue University and then at Penn on a Fulbright scholarship. On Supercool, we regularly talk with mayors. Why? Because the best of them, like Mauricio, do more than govern. They build. They're institutional entrepreneurs. They step into office for a brief window, and in that window of time, the buck stops with them. When it comes to climate, there's no one else to pass responsibility to. They have to cut emissions, mitigate risk, strengthen their local economy, and raise quality of life simultaneously. When Mauricio stepped into office in 2014, 56% of Quito's emissions came from transportation. So he built a subway from scratch. And 3 years later, it was finished on time, on budget, using state-of-the-art technology. That, of course, is extraordinary. Over the past 25 years, I've lived in New York, LA, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. 3 years to build a subway in one of those cities? Even contemplating that is laughable. So how did he do it in Quito, a city in the global south where access to capital is more constrained and the cost of that capital is significantly higher than in the US or Europe? That's just one of the things that makes Mauricio remarkable. He's an institutional entrepreneur and knows how to get hard things done. One of my favorite moments in this conversation is when Mauricio talks about rebuilding one of Quito's public parks. He didn't just clean it up, he reimagined it as shared civic infrastructure of the highest quality. He outfitted the running track with the same competition-grade surface used in elite international events, and then he opened it to the public for free. The result? Wealthy marathoners who used to train in private facilities or travel abroad now run alongside everyday residents in the middle of the city. That's what he calls a public luxury good. Infrastructure so excellent, so desirable, that everyone uses it regardless of wealth. And by attracting people across class lines into the same space, it strengthens the social fabric of the city. The subway, public luxury good. The park, public luxury good. Together they cut carbon and raise quality of life. They show what a sustainable future could feel like. Not one of sacrifice, but of delight. The kind of climate future that people actually want to live in. We connected with Mauricio through the Penn Institute for Urban Research, which serves as the secretariat for the SDSN Global Commission for the Urban SDG Finance. The commission brings together global mayors, finance leaders, academics, and voices from the private sector to solve one of the most urgent challenges in the climate economy, unlocking capital for cities. Mauricio co-founded the commission and plays a central role in its work, advancing new financial mechanisms like the Green Cities Guarantee Fund, which we'll hear about today. This is part 2 of our series in partnership with Penn, profiling the work of mayors who are part of the commission and leading the charge to boost urban climate finance. We spoke to Marvin Rees, former mayor of Bristol, England, on Supercool episode 41. And now, here's my conversation with Mauricio. Mauricio, welcome to Supercool.
Hello, Josh. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here.
As I was doing research and preparing to speak with you, something jumped out at me that struck me as unique. typically, well, I think it's typical when someone's entering politics, they start as mayor and then run for president. Your path is a little bit different. And I admire your background, how your journey has progressed. Can you take us through a little bit about your background and maybe how you got to your view on politics? And then we'll talk through climate and the other things we want to get into.
I would like to first start by saying that I felt a passion for public service since I was a little kid. So I knew very clearly what I wanted to do, and I tried to prepare myself to do it the best way possible. So this came very early in my life. And one of the things that I am very proud of is that after going to law school in Ecuador, I got a Fulbright scholarship with which I went to do my master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I actually did a double degree, a master's in government administration and a master's in political science. After that, I spent some years in Mexico. And while in Mexico, I founded a think tank focused on developing policies to fight against populism in Latin America. This was around 2007, 2008, when there was a great emergence of populist leaders, unfortunately, in Latin America, the kind of, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and in Ecuador, in my home country, Rafael Correa. So I decided to work on policies to fight against this big threat, which for me is really a terrible thing to happen to our region and to the world. And I did that through a public policy think tank, which was aimed at coming up with a responsible government model, as we called it. This was later on my political flagship when I came back to Ecuador and I founded a political party, a national political party, with which I decided to run for president in 2013, even though very few people knew of me. So I was a complete outsider. Some people thought, of course, that I was a bit crazy, and maybe I was. But I decided to challenge this super powerful president, Rafael Correa, who was not only a populist leader, but also a very authoritarian one. So people thought that, number one, I was crazy. Number two, that I was very bold to challenge someone like him and to actually run against him because he was running for his third re-election. Of course, I didn't win. But I did very well in that election. I was kind of the surprise of the election, so I became known. And the following year, I ran for mayor of Quito, the capital city. I ran against the incumbent mayor, who was from the same party as the president, who back then was, again, not only very powerful, but very popular. And against all odds, I end up winning the election with a big margin, approximately 21% difference with my opponent, the incumbent mayor. So that's something that the president didn't like very much, as you can imagine, because in Ecuador, becoming the mayor of Quito is kind of a stepping stone to becoming president. So he felt a little bit threatened by me back then, and he decided to make my life very difficult as mayor, but that's a different story. To summarize my answer to your question, I did things in a different way, but it worked out pretty well.
Thank you for walking me through that. What strikes me as you're describing that is we talk to a lot of entrepreneurs. I am a startup founder myself. To go to Mexico to start this think tank thinking about policy, to come back to Ecuador to run for president, there's something that seems to have that same sort of drive, right? It's different. It's not building a company, but it's almost like entrepreneurial in some way in the drive to either make it different, fix things, but the ambition to say, why not me? Why not now? Why should I wait if I feel that I have the ideas and I think I can win?
Absolutely. I see myself as an entrepreneur. I love creating new things. And, actually, I think that's the way of keeping myself entertained and passionate about what I'm doing. So I can tell you about different things that I've created throughout my life. A think tank, a national political party. After I finished my term as mayor, by the way, as mayor, I also created different things. But after my time as mayor, I went on to becoming a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania on a new topic, which was how to support cities accessing climate finance. And then I came up with the idea of creating what's now called the SDSN Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance, which is also an entrepreneurship. It's not a private company, but it's definitely entrepreneurship, an initiative that gathers mayors, leaders from international finance institutions, private sector leaders, academics, so on and so forth, to explore new and innovative financial mechanisms to support cities in developing climate-resilient infrastructure. And I can name a few other different initiatives that I created from scratch, and I really have fun doing that. I think that for me is absolutely key to having a drive and absolutely passionate about what I'm doing, because I think that's the key for success. And it has worked for me that way. So as long as I can keep having that feeling, I hope to keep creating new things in the future.
Yeah, I love that. It has full resonance with me. I think a lot of, not all, because there's different types of entrepreneurs, but I think a lot of us who have this creative drive are wired that same way. We're going to get into several of those initiatives. I want to come back to the moment you returned to Ecuador, you started a political party. The view of the political party is very interesting to me because we're going to talk about climate finance, we're going to talk about climate innovation, we're going to talk about how do you get that done, including building, especially as a mayor, as a politician, a coalition of support. And what I found interesting when I heard you talk about your political party, you had said what you guys founded, it wasn't left, it wasn't right. It really was about this practical approach to being responsible in everything that means. Responsive to the people's needs. That could be social justice, could be sustainable development, it could be income equality, poverty eradication, rule of law, respect for legal systems, all the things, as I'm hearing you talking, that authoritarian populist might not have a lot of actual interest in doing, but it's a response that's not necessarily left or right. This is just kind of practical. And that is not always the approach taken to addressing climate change. I know we want to talk about climate finance. I want to hear about that. Also, when you stepped into your role as mayor of Quito, I know that you got quite a bit done. So can you maybe just talk about that frame of how you approach climate action or sustainability from a mayoral perspective when you're in power? Because you're trying to help other cities and have more financing and funds to do that today. But help me understand how you approached making change happen.
First of all, I think that the political divide between left and right is a false dichotomy nowadays. It doesn't resonate with contemporary political debate. That divide was created in the 18th century in France under a completely different scenario than the one the world is experiencing today. So why should we keep subject to that obsolete political geometry? And I always challenge that. I don't believe in the left and right political divide. I think that what we are experiencing today in the world is a divide between populism and responsible governance. And you can be a populist leaning more towards the left or the right, just like you can be a responsible government leaning more to the left or the right. For me, what matters is whether you are a populist or a responsible government leader. And how do you define responsibility? That's, of course, a challenge. But I would say that responsibility means being democratic, being respectful to the rule of law, being respectful to the division of power, being respectful to people's freedom and human rights, being respectful of people's freedom to own property, being respectful of people's entrepreneurship character, and of course, being responsible means protecting the environment and fighting against climate change, which for me is the number one threat humanity faces today. So for me, having climate very high in your agenda is part of a responsible government. And that's what we try to do during my time as mayor. One of the first things we did is we measure where our CO2 emissions were coming from. And we came up, after studying this, it turned out that it was the mobility system responsible for 56% of our CO2 emissions in the city. So that's why we decided to focus our efforts on that particular topic. And that's why we decided to undertake the largest infrastructure project in the city's history, which is building our first metro line, which was a huge endeavor, very difficult to accomplish, but we managed to do so. It was because we were following a political logic. Whenever I was asked if I was coming from the left, the right, I was like, I don't believe in that question. I am trying to become a responsible government leader. That's in what I believe in. And for me, the criteria to define what's responsible is the kind of things that I just mentioned to you.
Let's stay on the metro line. So the biggest infrastructure project in the city's history, and you get it accomplished, you get it built, I believe, in 3 years. Some extraordinarily short amount of time, which, just thinking from a U.S. perspective about American cities, seems almost to defy the imagination that can be accomplished, right? So you do it in 3 years. I'm sure there's a lot that goes into that, but it sounds like there was a lot of resonance, a lot of favorability to the view of saying, hey, this is going to be good for our city on a lot of dimensions. It's going to be great for climate and for tackling emissions, but obviously this is going to improve the transportation system, it's going to improve mobility, and I also know that you didn't do just a metro line alone, right? There were other components as you start to think through the system.
This is the kind of project that it is absolutely transformative for a city. And I did it for several reasons. First of all, because I firmly believe that our city will be one before and after the metro. We are already experiencing that because the metro is already operating and very successfully. But the thing is, it is not just a mobility project. It is not just about capturing around 100,000 tons of CO2 per year. It is not only about taking out cars from the street because you can move from point A to B in a much faster and more comfortable and safe way. It is not only about developing economic growth in the areas around the stations by creating new commercial activity. It is not only about the metro becoming a key access for the future of urban planning in the city. It is also about people's pride. The fact that our city became one with a metro system. I always say that there are two different kinds of large cities, one with and one without this kind of high quality transportation systems. And that's something that I felt that needed to happen for our people, to regain a feeling of belonging to our city and our self-pride. So it was clear that the project had so many benefits that it was worth the effort. And it was extremely difficult to make it happen. As you mentioned, we built it in a record time of 3 years, which, by the way, was amazing because we met not only the calendar, but we also met the budget, which is unusual for these large infrastructure projects, which is, by the way, the nice side of the story. The sad part of the story is that I left office with 93% of the project ready, with trains already moving with passengers as trials, and with a roadmap to begin commercial operation in just 6 months after I left office. It took 5 years to start commercial operations. That was the sad part of the story. I mean, normally it's the other way around. What is hard to achieve is to build these large infrastructure projects on time, and we managed to do so. What's easier is to get them operative. In this case, it was the other way around because my successors, unfortunately, weren't able to put it in operation as it should happen. That's a different story. But the point that I'm trying to make is it is very difficult to implement these projects in time, on budget, and in addition to that, making sure that they will have the continuity to work properly. But good thing is, it is now working, people are very happy, and I think that it is transforming the city significantly, and it will do even more so in the future.
As you're talking about it, what triggers for me is years ago, I worked in economic development in Western North Carolina for the city of Asheville, which is like a hip, cool, happening town. It's just unfortunately decimated by a hurricane, but it's considered one of the hot cities in America. And we took a trip to Nashville, Tennessee, as an economic development team to understand what was happening in Nashville, because Nashville was already getting a lot of buzz, a lot of economic development happening there. And the question was asked to their mayor at the time, how'd you do this? You used to be a sleepy little country music town. Now you have this burgeoning city. And he said something similar, not as, well, I mean, similar. I was going to say not quite as civic, but just different. He said, the thing we did that changed our city is we built the football stadium. We built the NFL football stadium for the Tennessee Titans. And when we did that, It changed how we thought about ourselves. It changed how we thought about our city and that we could do big things. Then we got the hockey team and we built the convention center. And so that notion of what that means for a people to do something like that and how that can really change their conception of what's possible, I think that's really important. I think it often goes missed a little bit in some of these big projects and why they matter.
That's a key component. One thing that I am obsessed with is how to democratize our cities. I mean, we live in a highly unequal region. As you know, income inequality in Latin America is one of the highest in the world. And I think that one of the ways to balance that inequality is by creating spaces in which people from different social and economic classes would interact. And the only way for you to manage to do that, in the case of a city leader, is by developing high quality infrastructure, so high quality that that the rich and the poor will be attracted to interact in that space. And that's the kind of thing a metro project does. I mean, take New York. In New York, you will see people from the high income class and the low income class interacting, sharing exactly the same space. Because that's a good transportation system that is efficient, that it's high quality, that it works well for everybody. Okay, the same is happening here in Quito. The difference is that that didn't happen before. Because the rich move in a very nice car, whereas the poor was using a very low quality transportation system. Now they are both using the metro. And the same we did, for example, when transforming our public spaces. And let me tell you another anecdote about this, which I found really interesting. So we were about to rebuild our main urban park. Let's say you're trying to put a comparison. Let's say you want to rebuild the Central Park, okay? Of course, this one is not as huge as Central Park, but it's equally important for us. And I decided that I wanted to turn that park into a space for everybody to interact. So we decided to really turn this into a super nice place with high quality infrastructure, so high that everybody will be attracted to be there. And we decided to rebuild our racetrack in the park by having synthetic material, the kind of material that you see in the high competitions for professional athletes. Okay, we had that for free. So what happened, the rich that usually train for running in marathons around the world decided to use that public racetrack in a public park along with people from different social economic classes. So I was obsessed with creating spaces for social interaction because I think that once you do that, you really contribute to democratize your city. And I think that in a place like Quito, that was absolutely fundamental.
Wow. I'm so glad you brought that up. We've had this concept, particularly when it comes to climate, this idea of public luxury good. Like you mentioned, the subway in New York City, everyone takes it. It's not awesome, but it's very convenient, right? So everybody does take it. But I love the idea of developing infrastructure that is so wonderful that, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It's just everyone's there. And that idea of public luxury goods, I think, particularly around world-class transportation, is, that's what makes a city world-class. I mean, that's what makes a place people want to live, people want to be. And when we think about Supercool and what we're trying to communicate to our audience, we're not just solving climate so that we don't die, but solving climate is an opportunity to actually move to a future that can be better than today. So much of this comes back to having that vision. Let's go put in the infrastructure. It doesn't matter who you are. You're going to want to participate in this. I lived in Brooklyn for a few years, and they redid this pool that was this swimming pool near my apartment that had been created, I think, in the Public Works Administration of the Roosevelt era in the 1930s. And then it just languished. Nothing was happening there. But they reopened it, and it was so awesome and beautiful, everyone was there. Everybody went to the public swimming pool if you lived in that part of Brooklyn, because it was the best place to go swim. I just love that. I think it's so essential.
Instead of going to your, VIP club, you're going to go to the public racetrack because it's better.
Absolutely. It's so good. The other thought that I'm having, I didn't tell you, but I went to Penn as an undergrad. And I'm thinking that Your students, I would imagine, respond greatly to your passion and energy. I would imagine you have students who are pretty excited to be in class with you because that passion is probably impacting them. So we're going to transition. We're going to talk about climate finance and cities in a second. But that experience at Penn, you're teaching on climate finance. Do you see students who are deeply, deeply engaged with you in the subject matter and how they're thinking about their careers and what they want to do?
Yes. When I first went to Penn as a visiting scholar, I was supposed to be there only for one semester. And this is my 6th year teaching. So, I fell in love with it. I think Penn, it's my second home. And I am very grateful for the openness they have had for this initiative around cities climate finance. And I am absolutely grateful with Professor Ginny Birch, the co-director of the Penn Institute for Urban Research, for not only co-teaching this course with me, but also for supporting all of these initiatives in which we work together very closely. And yes, we've had several students that are currently pursuing a career on these particular topics after taking our class. It's amazing. The feeling is unparalleled because I really think that we need more and more talented people working on this. I think we need to have universities much more engaged on this particular topic. Universities are amazing places to not only think about this, to discuss this, but also to come up with innovative solutions. For me, addressing cities' access to climate finance is an existential task because cities are responsible for more than 70% of CO2 emissions. So without an effective role from cities, it will be impossible for countries to meet their NDCs, to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Now, for cities to become effective drivers in the battle against climate change, as I think they should, they need access to finance. And the problem is that cities are confronting a global financial architecture that was designed for countries, not for cities. It was designed back in the 1940s under Bretton Woods, when the world was not nearly as urbanized as it is today. Now things have changed. More than half of the world's population live in cities, and by the year 2050 will be more than 70% of people living in cities. So cities are at the forefront of dealing with some of the world's most pressing challenges, including climate. But to do that in an effective way, they need access to resources. And the system has not been designed for that. It is a system that is not fit for purpose in the highly urbanized world we live in today.
I didn't know that, or I certainly hadn't thought about it, that the global financial architecture we have today, it makes sense, designed for countries coming out of World War II. We're going to rebuild the world, not cities, at a time when the world is not nearly as urbanized. I mean, not even close. There's no China, there's no megacities, there's no Tokyo. I mean, it doesn't exist the way that the modern world does today. I hadn't thought about that as to why the architecture is in place, why now that architecture, it's outdated, it no longer works for the way the world is organized today. Let's talk about the SDSN Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance. That's quite a mouthful. I know that all means basically we need to get more climate finance to cities, and many of the world's leading mayors, thinkers on the subject matter are involved. Did you also create this? Is this part of your entrepreneurial journey as well?
Yes.
Are you a co-founder? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about it and the work that you're doing there and who's involved?
This comes from the fact that when I wanted to build a metro in Quito, I managed to get the finance from 4 multilateral development banks: the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, and the Latin American Development Bank. The problem was that in order to get their credits, I needed a national government's guarantee. A national government's guarantee that, guess what? The president, who didn't like me, didn't want to grant me. So it was really tough. What I had to do was to mobilize public opinion support in favor of the project, to put political pressure on the president, who had no choice but to give me the guarantee. But my point is, you shouldn't have to go through all of that to do the right thing. And unfortunately, that's what many mayors around the world are confronting. Because it is very frequent to have mayors from a different political party than the president. So my point is, it is scary to think that because of politics, cities are not able to do the right thing, to develop climate-resilient infrastructure to fight against climate change because of political rivalries with the national government. And why that is happening? Again, because the global financial architecture has been designed for countries. For example, only 44% of countries in the world allow cities to borrow. That means that 56% of countries proscribe cities from borrowing. And out of the 44% of countries in the world that allow cities to borrow, in many of them, including Ecuador, cities need a sovereign guarantee that is highly politicized, as I just described. So this is the kind of challenges cities have to face when trying to access finance. That's why we decided to create the SDSN Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance. This is an idea that Professor Ginny Birch and I discussed and then presented to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's a well-renowned development economist, and he heads the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN. And we decided to create this commission within the SDSN network. This commission is co-chaired by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, with whom I worked a lot as mayor of Quito in different international initiatives. It's also co-chaired by the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, Eduardo Paez, also a good friend with whom I worked as mayor, and by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And we perform the secretariat role of the commission, which gathers mayors, former mayors from around the world, leaders from different multilateral development banks and other international finance institutions, academics, private sector leaders, international organizations, some UN agencies, plus the OECD and others, to discuss innovative solutions to enhance cities' access to climate finance. As mentioned before, I think this is an existential task because I have no doubts about the level of ambition that many mayors have around climate worldwide. In many cases, their climate agendas are way more ambitious than the national ones. And their ability to perform is much greater because mayors, by nature, are all about delivering. And therefore, they are in a unique position to make things happen and to foster change. The problem is how to access finance. Cities would need approximately $4.3 trillion from now until 2030 to turn their infrastructure into a climate resilient one. It will be impossible for cities to access that amount of money under the status quo. We must reform the global financial architecture to make it more cities friendly, and that's the task of our commission.
Understood. Thank you for walking me through that. The question that is running through my mind is, to the degree there's resistance to that idea, is the resistance that, well, this would be new, we have to rethink the guarantees, who's on the hook if a project doesn't work? Is the resistance more from like, this introduces new risk? And or is the resistance a lot of people saying, well, we like things the way we are, we control the purse strings? What are you trying to overcome in building this new model for the global architecture for finance?
So I think it's a combination of those reasons. First, I have to say that national governments don't have any motivation to change the rule of a game that they control, right? I mean, take multilateral development banks, take the World Bank. Who sits on the World Bank's board? National governments' ministers of finance. They are the ones who decide how to allocate funds coming from the World Bank. And usually what they do is whenever they approve a loan to a country, then it is the national government of that country, the one who decides how the money will be allocated internally, most often under political criteria rather than technical one, as it should. So, number one, national governments are not interested in changing the status quo. Number two, I think there's a misperception of risk regarding cities. So whenever you talk with people in the finance industry, they will tell you, no. The problem is that working with cities, financing cities is too risky. There's a lot of political risk involved in dealing with cities. But we at the Commission decided to test whether that was true or not. And we came across a study developed by the European Investment Bank, analyzing default rates. Comparing default rates between local governments and the private sector for the last 20-something years. And it turned out that the default rates from local governments were lower than those from the private sector. So I would say there's a misperception of cities being too risky to deal with. But unfortunately, that misperception is there, and we have to address it. That is why we are working within the Commission in creating what we call the Green Cities Guarantees Fund, for it to become a city-focused guarantees facility managed by and for cities, with the aim of ensuring cities access to timely and affordable borrowing, to de-risk operations with cities, and to improve the credit conditions upon which cities are now accessing finance. Because unfortunately, because of this misperception of cities being too risky, the money that cities are accessing to right now is extremely expensive. If we come up with a city-dedicated guarantee fund, we may lower that risk and therefore improve the terms and conditions under which cities access that finance, and therefore cities will be motivated to undertake climate-resilient projects to tackle climate change in an effective way. In a nutshell, that's the idea behind the Green Cities Guarantees Fund.
One of the things I've heard said recently on this topic of climate finance, urban climate finance, it's not just a north-south divide, but if you're in one of those 44% of the countries where you can access a loan, and you're in, let's say, London or Paris or Stockholm or Chicago, you can probably get that loan at a much lower interest rate, thinking about your last point, than you can if you're in the developing world where the cost of capital is greater. Because I've heard it said that in the back rooms of different negotiations, whether it's through the UN, through COP or some other forum, sometimes people in Switzerland are like, well, cost of capital is not a big deal. And people are like, maybe you should travel outside of Switzerland, my friend, and look around. You might see a different reality. As you put together this group, this coalition, this initiative, how do you bring everyone together to share a common framework for what cities are advocating for globally?
Cities, both in the global north and in the global south, are experiencing different kinds of challenges when accessing finance. I would say that's pretty universal. Those challenges, of course, are different. Geography and context matters. For instance, cities in the US are very used to fund projects through municipal bonds, whereas in the global south, municipal bonds are almost non-existent. So the challenges are different, but the Commission is trying to address them considering those differences given geography and context. In the case of the developing world, something really interesting is happening. I would say that the developing world is misperceived as too risky. Again, when you actually look at the data, you will realize that the default rates in the developing world are not as high as people would imagine. So there's not a logical, fundamental reason why the developing world should be accessing money in a more expensive way than in the global north. There's no evidence that justifies that reality, but unfortunately, that's reality. So we need to address that. That's why we're coming up with this de-risking instrument, which, by the way, the Green Cities Guarantees Fund is not only aimed at de-risking operations and improving, therefore, the conditions upon which cities receive a loan, but also it is aimed at becoming an alternative guarantee mechanism to cities when compared with the highly politicized national sovereign guarantee that they, in many cases, are forced to get. So we need to rethink the way we're doing business, because it's not only that the developing world is not really as risky as people think, but also it is where cities will be expanding the most. And not only that, it is where, if you think about profitability, that's where we should be looking, because those are the markets that will be expanding the most when compared with global north markets. So even in terms of doing business, it makes a lot of sense to be focusing on the region of the world that will be growing, expanding the most. I think there's a fundamental change that needs to happen in the way we're allocating financial resources in the world. Going back to the urban expansion, as I mentioned before, the urban population will be growing significantly. But where is that going to happen? Basically in Asia and in Africa. That's where cities will be growing the most. We should be looking at those places, even if we look at them through a profit lens, because it will be much more profitable to do business in those places that will be expanding so much. And therefore, I think if we understand this reality, we can significantly change the way money is allocated. And that's the kind of work that the SDSN Global Commission is trying to contribute to.
Are there outliers? Are there cities? Are there projects that you look at today or you've over the past few years say, wow, we should really go look at how that city did X, Y, Z. They're doing such a good job. How did that mayor get that thing done? Do you case study those? I know you said you want to run a broader benchmarking study, but what jumps out?
I can definitely mention several cities that are doing amazing work. I would start by talking about Paris. Mayor Annie was one of our commission's co-chairs. She has been transforming Paris into a climate-friendly city. And that hasn't been easy. Taking cars out from around the Seine River wasn't easy, but she managed to do that. Increasing pedestrian-only street surface significantly, greening the city in an amazing way. I mean, she has managed really to transform Paris to face the challenges of the new era. Of course, Singapore is an amazing example of the same. We can mention cities like Copenhagen, cities like Melbourne in Australia, being very effective in tackling, for example, extreme heat-related risks, which is, by the way, another topic that I am very much involved with. I've been working with the Atlantic Council Climate Resilience Center, where, this is another entrepreneurship, I launched something called the City Champions for Heat Action Initiative, which is a group of mayors with whom we work to implement innovative solutions to tackle extreme heat-related risks. I have only mentioned cities in the global north. Now let's mention some cities in the global south as well. When I mentioned the city of Freetown in Sierra Leone, in Africa, well, their mayor, Yvonne Akisoyer, is doing fantastic work, advancing a very ambitious climate agenda, which, by the way, proves that you can do so in a low-income place. Because you have always the argument of whether shall we prioritize water, sanitation, energy, education. Of course, those are very important topics. But climate is also a very important topic because it's a matter of protecting people's lives. And I think that should be the number one priority for a public official, protecting people's lives. And now addressing climate is not a luxury. It's about protecting people's lives. And she's doing so. She has been implementing an award-winning initiative called Freetown, the Tree Town, by which she's planting more than 1 million trees, developing a very innovative community engagement mechanism to protect those trees and the way they grow. So the city of Buenos Aires have been very innovative in implementing climate-friendly policies, the city of Cape Town in South Africa, and I keep naming cities from around the world that have become role models and examples to follow suit.
Well, Mauricio, let me say this. I hopefully at some point can drop in and just sit in the back of the lecture hall in your class and listen as you talk about all this. It's been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge, your perspective, the work you're doing. I'm excited to follow and see what entrepreneurially comes next. Thank you for spending time with us. I appreciate the conversation.
You will be the first one to know. No, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and we will be more than honored to have you in our class. So I encourage you to attend.